The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Thomas Frank on why populism is the most important and misunderstood movement of our time. Roger Hickey on what solidarity means in this moment of crisis. And Bill Press digs into Trump's taxes with Forbes senior editor Dan Alexander. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Thomas Frank's newest book reminds us that the true history of populism in America is one of an ever-widening promise of a decent life for all. He says reclaiming that history is essential for a more just and equitable future. And we say hello to Roger Hickey, co-director and co-founder of the Campaign for America's Future and the Institute for America's Future. Roger Hickey, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Jim, thanks for having me on. Good to be here.
Our pleasure. Yeah, our pleasure to have you with us. The Campaign for America's Future recently launched a campaign called the Solidarity Agenda, and it takes the form of a pledge. Why did you choose a pledge to advance this agenda?
Well, it's a way for lots of people to be involved in what we think is the sort of the next chapter of that comes after the Democrats win in November. That is, we're all united right now, in part because Joe Biden has been very smart about bringing in all parts of the party and having a very broad-based platform, and yet the motivating force, as you know, is let's get rid of Donald Trump. Let's at least get the country stabilized and no longer crazy, and get the guy out of here. And after that, there's a debate, depending on how well we do in the Senate. There's a debate about how far we can go and how far the country needs to be changed. And that's where the Solidarity Agenda comes in. We chose, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and solidarity is clearly the goal of this agenda.
Yeah.
So what does solidarity mean at this point in our nation's history?
It's very, very clear that we've run up against the limits of individualism as an economic agenda. Since Ronald Reagan and even before, this country has periodically dismantled our collective ability to do big things. And the ideology that you could call individualism, you could call it neoliberalism, but the ideology has been, let the private sector run the country. Let the rich guys be in charge. And we've gotten to a point where we've seen the results of that deindustrialization, loss of good jobs, loss of vision for the country and a hope for the future. At the same time, we're running into these big collective challenges like global warming, like the COVID pandemic. And so it's clear to us that the next phase of American politics has got to be about everybody wins when everybody wins. It's got to be about joining together in solidarity to end the COVID crisis, to start rebuilding America, and it's got to be focused on a real social contract as well that guarantees that nobody's going to be poor in this country. that people can be able to live a decent life without being in desperation, as many people are right now.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
solidarity is an old labor term. It means I'll show up for you if you show up for me. Solidarity is kind of the essence of the opposite of neoliberalism, where it's every man for himself, every person for themselves. It's let's form a government that can make sure that we are all pulling together to build a future for all of us.
And, at the top of the agenda pledge is the phrase, resistance is not enough. Does this express a concern that for too many Democratic voters, this election is more about being against Trump than it is about being for a strong progressive future?
Well, we're all for resistance to Trump.
Absolutely.
That brings us together. And as you know, even some Republicans are in resistance to Trump right now. We want to encourage that. Resistance is very important. We said that all of the people, the 100 well-known people who've signed this thing, they are strongly in favor of getting rid of Trump. But there's a reason that Trump got elected in the first place. And that is we've been neglecting big, important parts of our economy that have left people out. They've left African Americans and people of color out. And they've also left the working class out as we have let the private sector go rampant, and we've deindustrialized our industries, and our communities. So it's very, very important, we think, to rebuild the country. It's not enough to go back to where we were when Obama was in charge or when FDR was in charge. We've got to build a trade regime, for example, that doesn't leave us completely naked in our ability to build new industries and save important industries like steel. We've got to have a social contract that gives people a certain confidence that they will not be destitute, that they can take risks in a new economy, that they can go forward and become active, productive members of the society. And that's why we think that getting rid of Trump is just the beginning. And there's a lot of people who feel that way. A lot of the people who supported Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and some of the other candidates who ran this time. That was fueled by idealism about what this country could become. And a lot of these folks want to become a force in the next period of our public debate and discussion and future.
You're remaining fractured, as I think many of them did in 2016. Clearly it was not the answer, and I think they probably understand that it's not the answer this time around either. And so I think it does bring more people to the table that just, let's start there, let's get rid of Donald Trump. And that's obviously, we can't go any further if we don't do that.
Yes.
Now, Roger, there are 5 principles to the Solidarity agenda. And one is that, quote, we will fight for good jobs, sustainable prosperity, and economic justice, close quote. We want to break it down in terms of specific policies. For example, the pledge calls for jobs for all. How does that translate into policy?
Well, it's pretty simple. It means that the country should guarantee that there are enough good, decent, well-paying jobs for everybody in the country who wants to work. Now, part of that is going to be with a vital private sector that's growing, and we need economic growth in the private sector. But it also means a guarantee that if there's not enough jobs, we invest in good jobs. And there's the other part of this equation is there's some big national efforts that need to be done. One is rebuilding our infrastructure, just rebuilding the sinews of the economy that you need. You got to have good roads and good transportation systems and good high-speed communication systems in order for a mass economy to work. And we've got to invest public money in that. And by so doing, you create a lot of jobs. Same way with the Green New Deal, which we endorse. We're having some progress on getting rid of a carbon-based system, just because oil and the oil companies have been so stupid. But we're going to need to invest in a whole new energy infrastructure in order to get to the goals that the Paris Accord set for the world. And that's going to mean creating good jobs in building all kinds of things, from solar arrays to windmills to refurbishing our lived environment, our housing. So we think that we've got to have a commitment to spending the money that it takes to do these big things. And if we do, we're not going to have any problem employing people in decent jobs.
Now, the agenda also calls to fight inequality. That, I mean, is underscored right now how badly that's needed. What are some of the specifics to this part of the pledge?
Yeah. As you know, even during this recession, the richest people in the country have made out like bandits. And the poorest people in the country, the middle class people in this country, have done very badly during this recession that was forced by COVID. So one thing that we've got to do is we've got to get the economy growing again. That's going to take a lot of work. It won't go away just by reopening the economy, whether we've conquered COVID or not. We're going to have to get the economy growing through those kinds of investments. We've also got to look at the rules that govern whether people pay taxes or not. Americans for Tax Fairness has laid out a whole agenda of the kinds of taxes that we could levy on the wealthy and the corporations, and still and be able to do the investment that we need. And that kind of taxation, it won't be the level that we had in World War II or after the war, but it'll create a more just society in which the people that can afford to pay are required to pay. So it's a whole series of things, including some basic guarantees that if you get sick, for example, you're not going to be in the poorhouse as well. Universal health care is something that would do an enormous amount to make this a less unequal society. And we're not talking about leveling so that everybody earns the same amount of money, but we are talking about readjusting the system that is now only enriching the very wealthy and the corporations.
We're speaking to Roger Hickey, co-director and co-founder of the Campaign for America's Future and the Institute for America's Future. Our conversation today focusing on the campaign called the Solidarity Agenda. Another principle, Roger, expressed in the agenda is a call for a new social contract. What needs to be part of that contract?
Well, as you can tell, all of this overlaps. The idea that if you are sick, you can be taken care of. You have a healthcare system that does not put people in the poorhouse. Does not. In fact, we endorse the idea of a Medicare for All plan, in which you don't pay a thing for healthcare. What you pay for is a graduated tax system that pays for the whole system. Other countries have done that. A guaranteed job is part of that. So we need what Roosevelt called the second economic Bill of Rights, which he elaborated just before he died. We need to move in that direction so that people have the confidence in this economy that they're going to be able to be okay. There's a certain baseline security, and from there they can afford to take risks and be participants in the private sector as well. So it's a social contract is something that we could have used in the last couple of years as COVID has hit us. Uh, we need to have a system where people can share jobs if we're really in a bad economic situation. That's part of the German social contract, and they've done very well. So the idea of a social contract is a basic guarantee of certain economic rights that people can count on, and not have to readjust their lives when they hit a rough spot. That includes a lot more effort and focus on housing, and almost a guarantee of housing that people can count on, especially in a recession like this, where, as we've learned, people are just a couple of months from economic disaster if they don't have a job. So social contract is an important thing. It's a common idea among other advanced countries, and we need to strengthen ours much more.
Now, as we're headed into this election, we are seeing a number of progressive candidates make it through to the general elections for Congress. Do you take that as an indication that voters are ready for this agenda?
Yeah, I think that we're in an economic crisis. Most voters realize how tattered our basic systems are for assuring people's economic security. And I think a whole lot of people who are in that category of progressive candidates are also talking about a new way to achieve economic growth. We're not in a good situation just relying on the private sector right now. We're going to have to stimulate the hell out of this economy, and people are wanting to send members of Congress and senators to Congress in order to get the economy moving again.
No matter what the outcome of this election, do you envision continuing this campaign beyond November?
Oh, yes, absolutely. In fact, in a way, we're just doing the preparatory work right now. We've got, as I said, 100 prominent signers of this pledge to work for this agenda. 20,000 additional activists around the country have signed on to the pledge, and that's going to grow. In fact, we think that there needs to be a faction within the Democratic Party who are known as Solidarity Democrats. There needs to be a group of people that are committed to working on this. As we get a decent Congress, and hopefully as we elect a new president, to make sure that we don't just fall back into the old patterns. So yes, the people who are signing on to this have more of a focus on after the election than they are. They're all working to get rid of the Republicans in this campaign the next few months. And we think this will help a little bit. It'll help motivate people who are working on the campaign to get out there and work some more. But our focus is really after the election.
And how can listeners learn more about the Solidarity Agenda?
They can go to campaignforamericasfuture.org, and it's right there. You can sign the pledge. We had a similar pledge going for a while, and we will be doing newsletters, and we don't pretend that we have all the answers. We're going to be sharing a lot of information that the environmental community and the women's groups and the labor people are evolving as to how to achieve these 5 principles, and we're going to be sharing that information and ways to get involved, not only with our group, with lots of other groups.
Campaignforamericasfuture.org is where you want to go if you want to get some more information. Roger Hickey, co-director and co-founder of the Campaign for America's Future and the Institute for America's Future, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Roger, we certainly appreciate your time with us. We're wishing you the best of luck and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you, Jim. Good to be there. Thanks.
Thank you. And
Good luck to all of us.
That's right, absolutely. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure,
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, a bold economic agenda based on the progressive principle of solidarity. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Shortly after taking office, Trump puffed himself up in full Trumpian pomposity to proclaim, "We will honor the American people with the truth and nothing else." Well, nothing else unless you count a record-shattering number of more than 20,000 documented lies he's uttered in only 3.5 years. He's now lying that a tsunami of voter fraud is about to hit our land and deny him re-election. Of course, as every investigation has concluded, the only widespread voter fraud in our country is the GOP fraud that voter fraud is rampant. But what's really at work here is that the Donald is in a cold panic about losing, so his only hope is to do two things. First, use the fraud bugaboo as an excuse to restrict voting in precincts that vote for Democrats. And second, delegitimize a Democratic win in advance by creating the myth that his loss could only be caused by hordes of illegal voters. Thus, he and his obsequious political party are actually spending untold millions of dollars in a disgraceful effort to try to keep American voters from casting ballots. Their tactics are worthy of the sleaziest of tin-pot dictators from the banana republics of old. For example, they've simply closed the neighborhood voting places in thousands of Democratic areas, and they've monkeyed with our nation's postal service in a crude effort to restrict mail-in voting. Then, William Barr, Trump's pathetic toady of an attorney general, even tried to boost the trickster's chances by ludicrously suggesting it might not be illegal for his backers to vote twice. This is Jim Hightower saying, so now, after promising he'd tell us nothing but the truth, Trump declared this year that he's entitled to re-election because, unlike so many who came before me, I keep my promises. Obviously, that's his fattest lie yet.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Solidarity is a powerful idea that calls on us to act in the common good over individual concerns. Roger Hickey outlines what that means as America envisions a post-COVID future. And we say hello to historian and journalist Thomas Frank, the author of 7 books, including Listen Liberal, Pity the Billionaire, The Wrecking Crew, and What's the Matter with Kansas. His most recent book, The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism. Thomas Frank, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
It's great to be here, Jim.
Nice to have you with us again as well. This is a book about the populist tradition in the United States and the reaction against it. What did populism mean when it first emerged in the United States?
So it started out, the word was consciously invented by some people in my home state of Kansas, and it referred to a third-party movement that was just getting going at the time. This is the early 1890s. It was a movement of farmers and industrial workers, and it was a left-wing third party. They wanted to change the way the U.S. currency was, to change how what the dollar was based on. They wanted farm programs. They wanted the government to do something about monopolies. They had a whole list of economic reforms that they were demanding. And that's the word was very specific and was spelled with an uppercase P all the way up into the 1950s. That was simply what it referred to. But you can extract from the significance of populism with the uppercase P is it's the first sort of economic movement of the economic left in this country that's very broad and widespread. They not only took over my home state of Kansas, they took over a whole lot of states. They were about as successful as a third-party movement can be in this country, and they were the equivalent of like the Labour Party in England, or the in Australia, or any of the social democratic parties that were rising up all over Europe at that time. It was basically the same idea. This was the American version of it.
Now, what you describe can be seen as the original intent of democracy. Yet, even in the beginning, populism, of course, had its critics. What were some of the earlier forms of anti-populism?
So the movement went, it sort of bounced along and went from strength to strength, and was growing by leaps and bounds through the first half of the 1890s. And then a funny thing happened, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more here in a minute, but the Democratic Party basically swerved to the left and absorbed populism. And when this happened, took over a bunch of their issues. And when this happened, the sort of establishment of this country, the East Coast, elite, by which I mean something specific like that. I'm not just throwing the word around the way like Donald Trump does. I mean something real. I mean the tycoons of the period, the newspaper publishers, the academic, the sort of celebrated academics, the society preachers. These people started denouncing populism in the most vituperative terms, in the most outrageous words they could find, and they always came back to a specific vision of it. Populism, which is a mass movement of working class people, of farmers and industrial workers, that a movement like this represents the bottom order of society trying to dictate to the people who are rightfully on top. It's the world turned upside down. This is always the anti-populist vision, that democracy makes this kind of inversion possible. That democracy makes it possible for people who have no business governing to take over. And that's the threat of populism. That's how they saw it.
Now, the 1896 presidential election, it's a significant turning point in the book. How did that election contribute to the decline of populism at that time, and how did it influence how we think about populism today?
Well, this is one of the great elections of American history, the great campaigns. They called it the Battle of the Standards, because what happened was the Democratic Party, as I mentioned, swerved to the left to embrace certain populist issues, the main one being the currency issue. So the Democrats decided that they were against the gold standard. The U.S. economy at the time was based on gold. The dollar's value was determined by the price of gold. And this was not a good system. As we people of 21st century America know, that was a terrible system. And the populists wanted to reform it. The Democrats got on board and sort of took that issue over. They called it free silver, the idea being we should be on a silver standard instead. And the Democrats nominated a charismatic 36-year-old congressman named William Jennings Bryan as their leader in 1896. And this came as an enormous shock to the nation. Nobody had ever heard of this guy before. He was from Nebraska. You know, the up until that point, the Democratic Party had been just as conservative as the Republicans. They were, Grover Cleveland, the sitting president, was in fact a Democrat. The convention had just tossed him overboard, it was this extraordinary moment. And this was when the Democratic Party, if you go back and look at Bryan's very famous speech to the convention in 1896 that won him the nomination, we call it the Cross of Gold speech, you can see in it the sort of beginning of a lot of the ideology that we associate with the Democratic Party. This is when the Democratic Party moves to the left and becomes the more left of the two parties in the two-party system. He talks about, for example, the trickle-down theory of an economy and why the Democrats are against that, which is a line that they still use to this day. But anyhow, so Bryan, this is when this, like I said, shockwaves ripple through the country. The Republican Party mobilizes behind William McKinley and the gold standard, and they raise this extraordinary amount of money from the great business, from the Fortune 500 of the era, and they outspend Bryan by 20 or 30 to 1. We don't really know for sure because they didn't have to reveal how much they spent back in those days, and it was this amazing campaign because they were able to crush the young upstart from Nebraska, who at first seemed like he was going to sweep everything before him because he had this magnetic personality and this gift of oratory, but he didn't have any money. So it's the original campaign where money makes all the difference. 1896, and they were able to beat him, and that was the end of that. And that, by the way, eventually that killed populism because the third party movement had made a huge compromise to get on board with the Democrats. And this was very controversial among their rank and file, but they justified it to themselves saying, when Bryan wins, we'll be able to, we'll have seats in the cabinet or something like that. We'll have some authority in Washington. And then, of course, when he lost, it looked like they'd compromised for nothing. And the party fell apart very quickly after that. And that was the end of it.
And there went any hope of a third party in this country, I guess, right?
Yeah, that was pretty much the last time anybody successfully built a national third party movement. Yeah.
Yeah. We're speaking with historian and journalist Thomas Frank. His latest book, The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism. All right, so the 1930s, the New Deal, it's a renaissance period for the values of the original vision of populism. Again, yes. There's backlash.
Yeah, the decade of the common man is how I like to call it. This is Franklin Roosevelt is in the White House. Organized labor is going from strength to strength. They're growing by leaps and bounds. Again, this fantastic growth. And you think of the culture of the period, the WPA murals in the post offices and the Frank Capra movies coming out of Hollywood. There was this celebration of ordinary people. You think of The Grapes of Wrath, that wonderful John Steinbeck novel, and the imagery of the period. But Franklin Roosevelt was actually getting these things done. It wasn't like William Jennings Bryan going up, in this sort of fruitless crusade. Roosevelt was elected and had Congress with him and was able to do all sorts of things. As we all remember, they called it the New Deal. He built the middle-class society. He regulated Wall Street banks, set up Social Security, legalized labor unions. You go right down the list, the amazing achievements that Franklin Roosevelt did. And again, the establishment came together against him. And this time, again, I'm using the word in a very specific sense. These very wealthy individuals came together with the newspapers of America and the economics profession and the legal profession and denounced Roosevelt in the most extreme language that was available to them. And this is another remarkable campaign in 1936 because they set up the first of the great right-wing front groups. It was called the American Liberty League. It was set up by the DuPont family and a bunch of other very wealthy people. And they proceeded to spend an enormous amount of money, much more than the Republican Party had or could spend. They spent an enormous amount of money blanketing America with pamphlets, newspaper editorials, and radio broadcasts denouncing Roosevelt in the most extreme terms, often using, as I discovered when I did this research, the science of eugenics against Roosevelt and what he represented, which was kind of surprising to me. But yeah, it was another great election, and this time the good guys won.
Now, jumping ahead a number of years, in the 1950s, we get to a point where the very idea of populism comes to mean essentially the opposite of its roots. Joe McCarthy was even described as a populist. How did that happen?
Isn't that it's a great question, and this is the big turning point. This is the halfway point in this book that I've written, where it happened with the American historical profession, which I came out of. Or I shouldn't take any credit. I studied history long ago, and so I'm very familiar with what I'm about to describe. An American historian named Richard Hofstadter, the greatest historian of his day, wrote a book about the Reform tradition, and in it did a kind of psychohistory, a psychological analysis of the populist movement, and decided that rather than being a movement of progress, it was a dangerous, almost a proto-fascist kind of movement. The larger argument was that whenever you got a whole lot of working class people together in a social movement, they would inevitably be racist, they would be xenophobic, they would be anti-intellectual, they would pine for the past. They would, all of these sort of irrational things would happen. And this came out of, as it turned out, this was not an accurate description of the populist movement. He was completely wrong in his description of the populist movement. But it was a good description of things that were happening around him at the time, specifically Joe McCarthy. But as is, the McCarthyism was going strong back then, and it was very frightening to a lot of intellectuals. But instead of attacking it as McCarthyism, they decided it was a different kind of ism. It represented what would happen when ordinary working class people sort of got their way. And they were the fears of these intellectuals in the 1950s were largely, a lot of this came out of World War II and their experience of fascism. A lot of it came out of this psychological literature about fascism. But they decided, for whatever reason, that the right word for McCarthy and his followers was populism. Now, this too was debunked, very, very quickly. It was completely wrong. McCarthy had nothing to do with populism. Probably didn't know what it was. Right. He was a conservative. Blah 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 blah. It was refuted. 8 ways to Sunday. But the larger sort of stereotype that Hofstadter and his colleagues set up, that stays with us. So this idea that what populism was, what populism always is, what the word means, is the sort of racist, bigoted, anti-intellectual movements of working class people. And we still use the word that way, even though it is completely erroneous.
Moving to the present day, to what extent do you see the original vision of populism in present-day American politics?
Well, you see this kind of horrible fake version of it all over the place. Not the real thing, but you see, and I don't just mean Donald Trump here, although of course that's who I'm referring to in the present day, but for the last 30 or 40 years, the Republican Party in America has mimicked language of sort of working class language, and mimicked the language of class grievance. You go back to, it starts with Richard Nixon, but it really, I was just watching a a documentary the other day about financial deregulation in America. That's the kind of thing that I'm really interested in, Jim. You know, the history of financial deregulation. Anyhow, but there was a speech from Ronald Reagan where he was talking about how much he adored, you know, ordinary people and how much, you know, he wanted to empower the people, and by deregulating banks. So this is classic. This is what they've been doing for years and years. Is the Republicans use this kind of populist language in service of a really anti-populist agenda, an agenda that empowers, you know, the very people who hated populism the most. And you see this most emphatically with Donald Trump, who, remember, campaigned against Wall Street in 2016, you know, campaigned on behalf of all these working people who've lost their jobs in these industrial states. And then what does he do as president? Of course, precisely the opposite as what he promised. That kind of sort of fake populism is everywhere nowadays. And I think one of the reasons that it thrives and that it's so successful is because the real deal is absolutely missing. You know, I have that chapter of the book about the 1930s, the whole spirit of the 1930s, you know, organized labor, Franklin Roosevelt, WPA murals, the visual, the feel of it, the poetry and the novels, all that is gone. That because the true bearers of that culture and that tradition are on the political left in this country. And for whatever reason, this is a much more complicated thing that we can't get into now, the political left in this country is really not all that interested in the fate of ordinary working class people anymore. They've got different issues that they care about, and they've completely lost track of the populist tradition in my view.
Well, now, do you have any sense that the Democratic Party and the American public are ready to support the vision of populism?
Oh, hell yes. Oh my God, yes. They basically demand it every election, but you know, is there going to be this fake? So I think that the great mistake that the Democrats make is that they make it over and over and over again, is that they turn their back on this very, very powerful rhetorical and political tradition. This tradition that, were they to embrace it, they would find sweeps everything before it. But they don't do it, they don't embrace it, and they don't use it for reasons of their own that are too complicated to go into here. And instead, they always embrace this kind of centrist balance, you know, and they bring Republican speakers to their convention, and they try to prove to the world that they're not a threat. They're not going to raise your taxes. They're not going to regulate banks again, you know, all this sort of thing. And the Republicans come out here with this fire-breathing, fake populist rhetoric and beat them, or, you know, when they have no right to win anything, you know, like Donald Trump is going to be using this language this fall he's going to be using this language in the highest register he can, and he has absolutely no right to it. Now, I don't dislike Joe Biden. I think Joe Biden is a really nice guy and a really good guy. And I think in his heart of hearts, he could be something of a populist were he to set his mind to it. But for whatever reason, he is so far campaigning as another moderate, another centrist. And I worry about the results. I worry about what's coming.
There seems to be a slow tug on him to try and pull him, you know, a little more towards populism, towards real populism, not the dirty word populism, the nice word populism.
Yes, but he's very suspicious of that. His advisors are very suspicious of that. Look, Democrats know what works. They know what sells, and they. You look at someone like Barack Obama, who was able to switch that populist vibe off and on, and he did a very good job at it. Or Bill Clinton, the same thing. But neither of them ever really delivered. Neither of them was able to sort of rescue the reputation of the Democrats. In fact, they did the opposite. They did not identify the Democrats with populism. They did the opposite. And you know, we're going to see what it takes. I mean, so far the Democrats. I'm speaking to you here in the month of. Is it still? No, today's the first day of September. So far, the Democrats seem to believe that if they just are not Donald Trump, if they present themselves as reasonable and disgusting human beings, that's all it's going to require. And they might be right. I mean, this guy Trump has bungled, his presidency so badly that I don't see how he gets, what he's going to do to get himself reelected. But we're going to find out, Jim.
Yes, we are, and hopefully he doesn't figure it out. I mean, I was shocked in 2016. I can't imagine I'll be shocked again the same way in 2020. But obviously, we don't know.
Let me say one last thing. A lesson from 1896 is never count these guys out. They're utterly cynical, and money. The Republican tradition. I mean uppercase R, the tradition of the Republican Party in this country is absolutely politically extremely astute. And they will find that weak spot and they will hit it with everything they've got.
We'll keep our fingers crossed. Historian and journalist Thomas Frank, the author of 7 books, including his latest, The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Thomas, as always, we appreciate your time with us. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Anytime, Jim. You got it.
Thanks very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. What Trump's taxes tell us about Trump, the businessman. Bill Press talks with Dan Alexander, author of White House Inc., How Donald Trump Turned the Presidency.
Your book is one of the most thoroughly, carefully researched books and just stock full of facts that I have ever read. So
thank you.
Congratulations. I mean, you have almost 200 pages of footnotes, right? So to make sure people, but back to Donald Trump, what he said in 2000, according to your book, he's done it and he's still doing it, right?
Well, he's done it in certain ways. He certainly tried to do it. And there are certain ways, like, for example, he is taking money that has been put into his campaign by his political supporters and then moving that money into his business while simultaneously not contributing any of his own funds, which are substantial, to the campaign. So therefore, it's other people's money turning into revenue for him. That's an example of him making money on running for president. However, business isn't predictable. And at a lot of his properties, the fact that he is president and that his brand is now so politically charged versus just being a luxury brand that was famous and, oh yeah, I saw The Apprentice. Now everyone has an opinion about it. And these aren't mild opinions in most cases. And so you lose a lot of potential customers. So fewer people are going to Trump National Doral, his golf resort in Miami. Fewer people are showing up at the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C. than otherwise would be. And so the values of those properties have taken a real hit. And overall, if you look at his portfolio, he's actually poorer today than he was when he took office. If he had done what all of the ethics advisors had suggested and just sold his business and then taken the proceeds and reinvested them in the market, the last time that I counted, and it changes based on what the market is doing, but the last time that I counted, he would have been $800 million richer if he had just taken their advice. And of course, he would have not had to deal with all the ethical headaches that he's been confronting over the last couple of years.
So in other words, he made a gamble that I'm not going to divest the way people, even I remember at the time, the Wall Street Journal editorial board advised. He made a gamble. He wasn't going to do it. And that gamble failed, didn't it?
It was both a bad political decision, which we probably knew at the time, given that the Wall Street Journal editorial board was criticizing it, and so was almost everyone else. But surprisingly, it was also a terrible business decision. And I think for future presidents, and for future billionaire presidents. I don't think we're done after one. It serves as a warning that if you want to do what's best for your presidency, you should get out of business. But if you want to do what's best for your business, you should also get out of business.
Yeah. Do we know how much Donald Trump is worth today?
Right now we have him at $2.5 billion. And, this is an exercise that for Forbes, I do it, twice a year. We take it very seriously. My notes on it are over 110 pages long every time that we do it, every 6 months. Whoa. We know every, profitability number into his properties. We know everything that we can know. And that's a lot. In fact, a lot than most people would imagine. And we tally up all of his debts. Right now we have him at $1.1 billion. And we tally up all of his assets. We have that at $3.7 billion. And because of rounding differences, the total comes to $2.5 billion for his net worth.
Right. Now, everything you said in the book is sort of confirmed and verified in spades by the New York Times bombshell that broke Sunday evening, I guess it was, right, about taxes, that he paid no taxes for 10 of the last 15 years, and $750 in 2016 and 2017. Did you know that? And were you surprised?
So what we knew was the contours of the business, which businesses were doing well, which ones weren't, why they were struggling, why they were doing well. Commercial real estate was doing very well. The hotels, particularly Doral and the one in DC, were struggling. We knew all of that. What we didn't know, and what the Times reporting was best at, was explaining how Trump managed to take a business that is very valuable and does throw out substantial operating profits. In other words, its day-to-day business does make a lot of money, and turn those operating profits on a tax form filed to the IRS into either minuscule profits or huge losses. That difference there between what happens on the actual business level and what happens on the form that the IRS sees was where their reporting was masterful.
Right. Did he do anything, from what you can see, from what the Times reported and what you've reported, illegal in not paying taxes? Or did he just take advantage of loopholes in the law?
So, we have a slow, careful, legal process for a reason, and that's to make sure that when we say people committed crimes, that they did commit crimes. But they don't open up investigations if they don't suspect things. And certainly the evidence that we have raises a lot of questions about whether Trump was violating the law or not. I think it would be premature to definitively declare, yes, he definitely broke the law, but certainly it doesn't look good for the president.
So, I'm not a lawyer, certainly not a tax lawyer. There are many opportunities for real estate developers to reduce their tax burden, if you will, right? Legally. But tax evasion is a federal crime, right? Is that what people are looking at?
And that's the line that we're trying to figure out, which side is he on? There's no question that Trump and his team are very, very aggressive in trying to avoid taxes. And some of the ways that they avoid them are perfectly legal. You're allowed to deduct interest expenses from large loans that you hold, of which there are many in Trump's portfolio. You're allowed to take depreciation, of which there is a lot in Trump's portfolio, particularly on his golf properties that he's just sunk enormous amounts of cash into that he doesn't seem to be getting much of a return on. So those are things that are legal and frankly expected for somebody in the real estate business. Where it gets murkier and where the investigators will have more work to do is on things like, for example, it appears that they were paying Ivanka Trump a consulting fee at the same time that she was serving as an employee of the Trump organization. Now, that would allow Donald Trump to reduce his tax burden, but it would cost the American taxpayers money. And it doesn't look like you are allowed to do that. So that's a question where there's going to be a lot of investigation there. But there are example after example of these things that they took very aggressive stances on that might expose them to some issues.
Is there any way to estimate what a man who's worth $2.5 billion should have paid in taxes?
Well, it's a good question. I'll tell you this, that his operating profits from his businesses are about $160 million a year. Okay. Now, you're going to be able to deduct some things after $160 million, even if you're playing by all the rules. You're going to be able to deduct depreciation, interest, and all of that. And although interest you can figure out very easily, depreciation is a much, much more difficult thing to estimate, which makes it difficult to know exactly how low he could have gotten that bill. But what we do know is sort of a maximum ceiling because of the size of the operating profits. You know, if you take whatever 30% of $160 million, you know, that's about the most that he could have paid. So call it 50 and change in taxes. But it would have certainly been less than that.
And and with the ongoing tax rate, he would have paid that rate on 110 million, is what you're saying, right?
Right. Yeah. On $160 million, you know, roughly in operating profits per year.
One of the things that you point out in the book is that it must be difficult to figure out A, how much Donald Trump is worth, or B, how much he owes in taxes, because I'll use the word, he lies. He lies about how much money his properties are making. He lies about how much square footage he has. He lies about how many floors are in his buildings, how many rooms are in his buildings or hotels.
Right. I mean, and you know, I'll use that word too. It's consistent enough. And what he says is divergent enough from the facts that we know and can see in documents. And he is familiar enough with his own business that there is no way to look at the quantity and quality of his statements and conclude that those are anything else but lies. He is actively lying to try to get Forbes to estimate that his net worth is higher than it actually is. Now, the good news is that real estate, for all of its murkiness, is actually a fairly transparent industry because there are large loans against these buildings. And because those loans are chopped up and sold, there's a lot of information that flows to investors about Trump's financial standing. And so we have independent documentation that tells us what the profitability is of his different properties. And then we can talk to industry experts. You know, we spoke to over 100 people in various different parts of his industry to figure out what these things might actually be worth. And ultimately, at the end of this 110-page document, you get a number, and that number changes month to month. But right now, it's at $2.5 billion.
Right. So one of the reasons that Donald Trump is where he is he sold himself to the American people as a phenomenally successful businessman. Mm-hmm. You've looked at it, every aspect of it, in your book, White House Inc. How good a businessman is he?
He's very good at certain things. He's very good, for example, at negotiating with his lenders, so that then he doesn't have to pay them back as much money as he originally said that he would. He's very good at delaying legal fights in ways when he is pinched that allow the rest of his business to recover, and then he can pay whatever penalty or settlement he has to pay in that legal fight. So he's really, really good at a couple of things. What he's not good at is making strategic business decisions. If you just look at Trump National Doral, his golf resort in Miami, he bought the thing for $150 million. He then invested $213 million of fresh cash into that business. So that takes you to $363 million. We now value the business at $153 million. So that's $210 million down the drain. That's bad business. He doesn't necessarily recognize the return that he's going to get on a dollar. In the places where he's been successful, Trump Tower was a great development for him. He was able to sell sort of the opulence and the luxury. He is a great salesman. And he sold a bunch of condos in that building and made a boatload of money. The other properties in which he's done very well are in some cases ones where he's bought at rock bottom. So for instance, he bought and then reinvested in 40 Wall Street, which is a skyscraper in the financial district of New York. both the purchase and the reinvestment was a reported $35 million. That building right now is worth an estimated $401 million. So that's, if you buy it at bargain prices, you can do pretty well. And he's done that in certain situations. He's also in other situations, just to put it frankly, gotten lucky. His two most successful deals, 1290 Avenue of the Americas and 555 California Street, are deals in which he owns a 30% interest alongside publicly traded firm Vornado Realty Trust. Now, Vornado runs a very, very professional operation. And because they own 70% of these properties, they're the ones running the show. And they've made an incredible amount of money at those buildings. Those two buildings alone are worth more than $900 million. Now, that's before debt. So these are huge properties that have done really, really well. And you look at the whole portfolio and you look for a conclusion. Is he a good business person or not? The answer is, well, not really. But he does do some things very well. And his tenacity and his salesmanship are probably his two greatest traits from a business perspective.
Yeah, and I guess the other side of that story, examples, you mentioned the Doral Golf Course, the Plaza Hotel in New York. Not such a great success, right?
Well, you know the old phrase, like don't get too excited when you see the buffet or whatever. Don't order everything on the menu. That's kind of what he did with the Plaza Hotel. He bought the thing for $407 million, and he said at the time that he purchased it that he knew he was making a bad deal. But basically that he just couldn't get over the idea that he could own the plaza. He can see it out of the window of his office in Trump Tower, and it's a beautiful building. And so he way overpaid for it. And of course, it's amazing. And of course, within no time, the property was in bankruptcy.
How's Mar-a-Lago doing?
Mar-a-Lago is doing fantastic from a business perspective. And, if you think about the sorts of clientele that Mar-a-Lago attracts, so you're looking for very wealthy people who really want to hobnob with other very wealthy people. And is there a more exciting guest to have at a party than the President of the United States? Probably not. And what if he's the host of the party every single time that he's there? So lots of people have poured lots of money into Mar-a-Lago. The initiation fees and the amount of revenue that came into that business jumped very dramatically when Trump won the election and in his first year in office. They've flattened off a little bit since then. But that's an example of a property that has certainly benefited from him being president. We value that one at $180 million.
Are the many bankruptcies that Donald Trump, or several at least, do they indicate Donald Trump is just skillful at using bankruptcy law, or again, that he's failed as a businessman?
Mostly they indicate the big appetite thing. He spends a lot of money to buy properties, and a lot of the money that he spends is not his. It comes from banks. And eventually banks want to get that money back. And so if your properties don't throw off enough cash to pay him back, then eventually you declare bankruptcy and they take them. That's basically how that goes. So no, there's nothing really skillful about being forced into bankruptcy. It just means that you've been put into a bad position. And that's happened over and over with him.
Bill Press with Dan Alexander, author of White House Inc., How Donald Trump Turned the Presidency. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Thomas Frank, Roger Hickey, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.